The wind was sharp on the ridge, and it carried the smell of dust and stone. Private Sarah Kane lay flat on her stomach, with her elbows in the dirt and her eyes fixed on the patrol far below. She was not there to fight. That was not her job. She was support, and her job was to see what others could not see and tell them before it was too late. The ridge was high and narrow, with jagged rocks sticking out like teeth, and the valley below was wide and dry with only a few broken bushes and dead tree stumps. Her patrol moved slowly through the old riverbed, following the path between two low hills. They were small shapes from up here, but Sarah knew every one of them by the way they walked and carried their rifles. She had been told this was a routine move, just a standard sweep to check for enemy activity in the sector. Nothing serious. But Sarah had learned that in this place, nothing stayed routine for long. Her binoculars were heavy in her hands, but she kept them steady at first. There was nothing to see except the shimmer of heat in the distance and the thin, wavering air that made the far hills look like they were floating. Then something shifted at the edge of her vision. She almost thought it was a trick of the light, until she caught it again, a faint movement behind a rock to the left of the patrol. It was small, but it was too deliberate to be the wind. She turned the focus wheel slowly, and the blur became a shape. A head. Someone was watching her patrol from the rocks above them, and then another figure slid into view beside the first. Her heart began to beat faster, and her throat felt dry. Sarah reached for her radio and pressed the talk button. Static hissed in her ear, and she tried again. The sound was broken, like a whisper through water. She could make out a faint voice from Sergeant Miller, but the words were cut off. She pressed harder and spoke fast, trying to warn them about the movement on the ridge. But the only reply was more static. She glanced back through the binoculars, and her stomach tightened. The two figures were no longer just watching. One of them was setting up something long and dark against the rock. It took her a moment to understand a rifle, a long one with a scope. The barrel pointed toward the patrol down below. The soldiers kept moving, unaware of the danger above them. Sarah could almost see the invisible line between the sniper and the lead man in the patrol. She wanted to shout, but they could not hear her from this distance, and the radio was useless. She slapped the side of the device, trying to clear the signal, but it was no good. She looked again and saw the glint of sunlight off the sniper's scope. The figure leaned into the rifle and shifted position. It was happening now, and she had seconds, maybe less. A faint sound carried up to her from below. It was a dull popping noise. At first, she thought it was just a rock falling, but then another came, and another gunfire. Small cracks echoed off. The ridge walls and the patrol dropped low, looking for cover. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. They had walked right into an ambush. Her hands felt cold, but her mind was racing. She had not fired her rifle in real combat before. That was not her job, and she had strict orders to observe only. But watching now, she felt something hard building inside her chest. She could see the enemy sniper shifting slightly to get a better aim at one of the men below, who was pinned behind a small rock barely, large enough to cover his helmet. If the sniper fired again, he would not miss. Sarah bit her lip and slid her own rifle forward. It felt heavy but solid in her grip. The strap dug into her shoulder as she settled behind it. She had trained for this, but training was different from reality. Her instructors had taught her about breathing and trigger squeeze and how to find the still moment between heartbeats. She tried to remember all of it as she brought the scope to her eye. The crosshairs trembled for a second, then steadied. She could feel every muscle in her body tense as she watched the sniper down below line up his shot. In her scope, he was just a dark figure against pale stone, but she could see the slow rise and fall of his shoulders. As he breathed, Sarah's own breath came shallow and slow. The sound of distant gunfire rolled through the valley, but up here it was strangely quiet except for the wind. Her finger rested on the trigger. She knew one shot could change everything. It could save the man in the patrol, or it could give away her position and put her in the sniper's sights. She hesitated for a heartbeat, trying to decide if breaking her orders was worth the risk. Below, the man behind the small rock shifted his position and exposed his arm. The sniper adjusted his aim, and Sarah's chest tightened. She did not feel like support anymore. She felt like the only one who could stop what was about to happen. She breathed in slowly and let the air out in a long, controlled stream. Her finger curled a little more on the trigger. The enemy sniper's head was still in her crosshairs, and the world seemed to slow around her. Somewhere deep inside her, a choice was made, and there was no going back. Sarah's finger hovered on the trigger, and the wind on the ridge felt colder now, as if the air itself was warning her about what was coming. Below, the enemy sniper was steady and patient, his cheek pressed to the stock of his rifle as if time did not matter. The man in the patrol was still pinned behind that tiny rock, and Sarah could see his helmet shifting as he tried to press lower into cover. She knew she had seconds before the enemy made his shot, and those seconds were melting away. Sound of distant gunfire was louder now, and mixed with shouts echoing through the dry valley walls. Another burst of static hissed in her earpiece, and this time she caught a broken fragment of Sergeant Miller's voice telling them to hold position. But his words were swallowed by interference. She clenched her teeth and focused through her scope. Her heart pounded in a heavy, slow rhythm, and she waited for the still space between beats, just like they taught her in training. She pulled the trigger. Rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the echo rolled down the ridge like a wave. In her scope, she saw the enemy jerk sideways and drop out of sight behind the rock. For a moment, she could not tell if she had hit him or just forced him to duck. But the patrol below used the moment to shift to slightly better cover, crawling behind a larger cluster of stones. It gave them a few more feet of safety, but it was far from enough. Sarah slid back from her firing spot and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled, but she tightened her grip on the rifle and crawled to a different position along the ridge to avoid being spotted. The rocks scraped her elbows and the grit stuck to her skin. She had barely moved 5 meters when a sharp crack split the air, and a puff of dust exploded inches from her face. The enemy had found her. She pressed herself low and scanned with her eyes over the edge. Another muzzle flash came from a dark opening further up the enemy's side of the ridge. This was a second shooter, and he had a clear view of her spot from before. If she stayed in one place too long, she would not have a chance to fire again. She slid down behind a jagged rock and tried the radio, but only static answered. Below, the patrol was still trapped. The gunfire had slowed for a moment, but now it was picking up again. As the attackers tried to push closer, Sarah could see 2 enemy fighters moving between rocks, advancing in short bursts. They carried rifles, but one of them had a long tube slung over his back, and her stomach tightened at the sight. It could only be a rocket launcher. If they reached a good angle, the patrol would have no cover. Left. Her mind raced. She had not been sent here to fight yet. Every choice in front of her now involved fighting. She scanned the ridge and spotted a narrow ledge that curved closer to the enemy position. If she could move along it, she might get a better line on the advancing fighters. It would also take her dangerously, close to where the second shooter was firing from. There was no time to weigh it longer. She pressed herself flat and began to crawl. The ledge was barely wide enough for her elbows, and at one point the drop below made her stomach twist. Loose stones fell away into the valley, and she froze each time, hoping the noise would not draw attention. Her knees were scraped and her rifle banged against the rock, but she kept moving. Every few seconds she glanced at the patrol to see if they were still. Holding they were, but their cover was shrinking under the incoming fire. She reached a small rise in the ridge and peered over. From here she could see the 2 advancing fighters much more clearly. They were only 50 meters from the patrol now, and the one with the launcher was starting to swing it into position. Sarah set her rifle on the rock and tried to steady her breathing. The first shot had been hard, but this one felt harder. If she missed, the patrol would not have time to recover. Placed the crosshairs on the fighter with the launcher. The wind was stronger here, and it tugged at her sleeves, making the aim harder to hold. She pulled the trigger, and the recoil thudded into her shoulder. The fighter staggered and fell sideways, dropping the launcher, but the other enemy grabbed it instantly and kept moving. Sarah fired again, and the second fighter dove behind a rock, disappearing from sight. Shouts rose from below as the patrol took advantage of the sudden break and shifted positions again. They were closer now to a shallow rise that could give them better defense. Sarah scanned for the second shooter but could not find him, and the absence made her uneasy. A sharp, metallic click came from somewhere above her, and she froze. It was the sound of a rifle bolt sliding into place, and it was close, very close. Sarah did not move. The sound of the rifle bolt above her was like ice in her veins, and her body froze as if the air had turned solid. Her eyes shifted upward without raising her head, and she caught a glimpse of a shadow against the sunlit rock. Someone was crouched just above the ridge line, less than 5 meters away, and the angle told her they had a perfect shot if she made the wrong move. The wind howled between the stones and carried the smell of dust and gunpowder, but the world felt quiet, except for the pounding in her ears. She eased her body closer to the rock edge, trying to make herself smaller. Her fingers tightened on her rifle, but she did not raise it yet, because any quick movement might draw fire instantly. The shadow above shifted slightly, and a small pebble rolled down toward her, stopping just short of her elbow. She held her breath and waited for some clue of what the figure would do. A sudden shout came from down in the valley, drawing her eyes for half a second. The patrol was still moving toward the shallow rise, but now enemy fire raked the slope and forced them down again. One soldier stumbled, and 2 others pulled him toward cover. Sarah's gut twisted at the sight, and she knew if she did not act soon, the attackers would crush them completely. She took a slow breath and slid her rifle forward inch by inch until the barrel rested against the edge of the rock. Her cheek pressed to the stock, and her eye found the scope. The shadow above her was now fully in sight, and she saw the enemy's face for the first time. It was younger than she expected and streaked with dust, but the eyes were cold and steady as they scanned the valley for targets. He had not seen her yet, and the angle was narrow, but it was enough. Sarah pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, and the enemy toppled sideways down the slope, his rifle clattering against the stone. The echo of the shot rolled away into the distance, and for a moment, there was no movement. Then more gunfire erupted from the far side, as if the attackers were answering her strike. She ducked low and scrambled along the ledge to avoid being pinned in one spot again. Her knees ached and her lungs burned, but she pushed forward because the patrol's survival was now tied to her position on this ridge. Every few seconds, she glanced at the valley to track their movement and saw they were edging closer to the ridge wall, which might give them a route out of the kill zone. A burst of rounds snapped into the rock just behind her shoulder, spraying sharp fragments across her back. She spun and spotted a figure darting between 2 stones higher up the slope. Without thinking, she dropped to one knee, aimed, and fired. The figure dropped out of sight, and Sarah did not wait to confirm the hit. She kept moving, because every second here was a gamble with her life. The ridge narrowed until she had to crawl on her stomach, the stone pressing against her ribs. From here, she could see a wider section of the valley, and to her shock, more enemy fighters were appearing from a dry gully on the far side, moving fast toward the patrol's flank. They carried rifles, and one of them was dragging a heavy bag that looked like it held explosives. If they reached the patrol from that side, there would be no escape. Sarah shifted her rifle and lined up her sights on the lead man. She fired, and he dropped the bag and fell, but the others scattered for cover among the rocks. She fired again and again, forcing them to keep their heads down. The patrol below noticed the break in fire and began to push toward the ridge wall at a faster pace. Her magazine was almost empty now, and she could feel the weight of that fact pressing down on her. She reached into her vest for another, but her fingers closed on air. Her last reload was still in her pack 20 meters back along the ledge, where she had left it to move light and fast. She swallowed hard and took a deep breath. If she went back, she would risk being caught in the open by the second or third enemy shooters she had not yet spotted. If she stayed, she might not have enough rounds to hold them off. The decision felt heavier than the rifle in her hands. She kept one eye on the enemy positions and one eye on the patrol. The wounded soldier was still moving with help, but slower now, and the enemy from the gully was starting to shift again to test her aim. Sarah bit her lip and began crawling backward along the ledge, trying to stay low. Her knees scraped against the stone, and she kept her head down as another burst of fire chewed into the rock just above her. The pack was still where she had left it, wedged between two boulders. She grabbed it, pulled out the spare magazine, and slammed it into her rifle in one smooth motion. The sound of it locking in felt like a lifeline. She rolled back to the edge, ready to fire again, but as she aimed toward the gully, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the far side of the ridgeline, 3 enemy fighters were climbing up toward her position, using the cover of a narrow crack in the stone. They were too close, and if they reached the top, she would be trapped with no room to maneuver. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears as she watched the 3 enemy fighters climb toward her position, using the jagged crack in the ridge for cover. They moved fast and silent, each one gripping the stone with sure hands as if they had climbed. This path many times before her mind raced, because she knew that if they reached the top, she would have no space to aim, no space to run, and no chance to reload again. The wind whipped over the ridge, carrying dust into her eyes and making them sting, but she kept her focus on the dark shapes closing the distance. She shifted her rifle and aimed down into the crack, but the enemy moved in quick bursts, hiding behind protruding rocks and making it hard to get a clear shot. The leader of the 3 raised his head for a moment to check the way ahead, and Sarah squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the air, and the man's body slumped against the stone before sliding down out of sight. The other 2 froze for a second, then pressed themselves tighter against the rock to stay hidden. Below in the valley, the patrol was still pushing toward the ridge wall. Under heavy fire from the opposite side, Sarah could hear faint shouts and see flashes of movement as her team tried to fight. Their way out, one of them looked up toward her position, and she could almost feel their unspoken plea for her to keep holding the high ground. The 2 remaining climbers began moving again, more cautiously now, and Sarah realized she had to finish. This before they reached the top. She fired at the second one, but the bullet sparked against the rock, and the man dropped lower into the shadows. The 3rd fighter used the distraction to climb faster, and now he was only a few meters from the ridge edge. Sarah stepped back from her firing spot and moved along the ledge to find a better angle. The stone was rough under her boots, and every step sent small pebbles skittering down into the crack. She knelt and leaned over the edge, just as the 3rd fighter's hand appeared, gripping the lip of the ridge. Without hesitation, she swung the butt of her rifle down hard against the hand, and the man let out a sharp cry before falling back into the crack. He caught himself partway down, but it slowed, their climb giving her another precious moment. She returned to her firing position and aimed again into the shadows. This time, the 2nd climber made the mistake of exposing his shoulder, and Sarah's shot caught him, sending him tumbling against the wall. The last one below tried to fire upward blindly, and the bullets whined off the stone near her head, forcing her to pull back for cover. Her breath came fast and ragged now, and her shoulders ached from holding the rifle so tight. She peeked over the ridge again and saw the final climber retreating down into the crack, apparently deciding the risk was too high. For now, she had the top to herself. She turned her attention back to the valley, and her stomach tightened. The fighters from the gully were moving again, advancing in short bursts and using every scrap of cover. The patrol had reached the base of the ridge wall, but they were trapped there under fire from 2 sides. Sarah searched for the source of the heaviest fire and spotted a machine gun nest dug in behind a cluster of rocks halfway up the opposite slope. The gunner was pouring rounds into the patrol's position, pinning them flat. She lined up her scope on the gunner and fired, but the first shot hit the shield. In front of him, the gun kept hammering out rounds and the sound echoed like thunder in the valley. Sarah adjusted her aim for the narrow gap above the shield and fired again. This time, the gunner slumped forward and the weapon fell silent. The break in fire allowed the patrol to move a few meters along the wall toward a small outcrop that offered more cover, but she could see they were still far from safe because more enemy fighters were gathering at the far end of the valley, possibly preparing to rush in. She checked her magazine and felt the sharp twist of worry when she counted only 5 rounds left. Her water was gone too, and her throat felt dry and raw from the dust. Still, she pushed the discomfort aside and focused on the task because there was no one else on this ridge to stop the enemy from closing in. A sudden explosion shook the valley, and she flinched at the shock wave. A plume of smoke rose from near the gully where the enemy fighters had been moving earlier. She could not tell if it was from one of their weapons misfiring or if the patrol had managed to set off something as a distraction. Either way, the noise threw the attackers into momentary confusion, and she took advantage of it. Sarah fired twice into the group, nearest the ridge wall, forcing them back. Then she shifted her aim to the far end of the valley, where the gathering fighters had started to move. Her last shot in the magazine found its mark, and one of the leaders dropped, causing the rest to scatter. Briefly, she ejected the empty magazine and reached for another, but found only the weight of the rifle in her hands. Her spare ammo was gone, and the ridge felt suddenly very quiet, except for the distant shouts echoing between the rocks. She glanced down at the patrol and saw Sergeant Miller looking up at her and signaling urgently. Sarah knew what the signal meant, and her heart sank. The enemy was preparing for one final push, and she would have to hold them off with nothing but her last grenade, and the hope that help would arrive in time. Sarah crouched low behind the jagged rock, her fingers wrapped tight around the cold metal of her last grenade. The sound of the wind was drowned out now by the distant roar of voices echoing through the valley as the enemy prepared their final push. From her high point on the ridge, she could see them gathering in the shadows of the far slope, moving into small groups like wolves circling prey. The patrol was pinned at the base of the ridge wall, and though they had better cover now, their position would not hold if the attackers rushed all at once. Sarah's breath was quick and shallow, and she tried to calm it by focusing on the weight of the grenade in her hand. It felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the lives of everyone below. She glanced down at the patrol and saw Sergeant Miller still looking up at her, signaling for her to hold her ground. She nodded, even though she knew he could not see the gesture from that distance. The enemy began to move. They fanned out across the valley, using the terrain to shield their approach, and Sarah's mind raced. With no ammunition left in her rifle, her choices were few. She could wait until they were almost at the base of the ridge and then throw the grenade to break their charge, but if she misjudged the timing, they would be too close and she would not survive. She could try to climb down to the patrol, but that meant leaving the high ground and exposing herself to fire from above. A shadow passed across her position, as clouds drifted over the sun, dimming the light and deepening the tension. She kept her body low and crawled to a slightly better vantage point, where the slope of the ridge gave her a view of both the advancing enemy and the patrol's position. The enemy was close now, maybe 50 meters from the base of the ridge and closing fast. She pulled the pin from the grenade and held it tight, feeling the vibration of her own heartbeat. In her palm-woven group of enemy fighters broke ahead of the others, sprinting toward the left side of the patrol's position. Sarah hurled the grenade with all her strength. It arced down in a blur and landed just behind a boulder where the runners had taken cover. The explosion ripped through the air with a deafening roar, and a wave of dust and smoke rushed outward. 2 of the enemy went down instantly, and the rest scattered momentarily in confusion. The patrol seized the chance to fire back, and their rifles cracked sharply against the rocks. Sarah ducked behind the ridge edge as return fire from the far slope sprayed the stone above her head. Her ears rang from the blast, and her hands felt strangely light without the weight of the grenade. She knew she had no more weapons to use, and that meant her role now was to move fast, stay unseen, and help the patrol in another way. She crawled along the ridge, searching for a path that could bring her closer to the patrol without exposing her to enemy eyes. Her boots slipped on loose gravel, and small stones tumbled down toward the valley. She winced at the noise, but kept going. A narrow ledge curved down toward the lower slope, and she decided to take it. Her descent was slow and careful, her body pressed close to the rock to avoid slipping entirely. Halfway down, she froze. 2 enemy fighters were climbing up from the opposite side of the ridge, trying to flank the patrol from above. They had not seen her yet, and they were focused on the men below. Sarah's eyes darted around for anything she could use as a weapon. Her rifle was empty, and her sidearm had been lost earlier when she shifted positions under fire. Then she spotted a fist-sized rock near her boot and picked it up. It was a small chance, but she needed to take it. She leaned out just enough to let the rock fall straight toward the lead climber. It struck his helmet with a hollow thud, and he slipped, losing his grip and crashing into the man below. Both tumbled down a short distance before catching themselves on a lower ledge. But the noise drew the attention of the patrol, who quickly turned their fire toward that side. Using the distraction, Sarah kept moving down the ridge until she was close enough to see the faces of her team clearly. Sergeant Miller spotted her and motioned for her to hurry. She slid the last few meters down and landed beside a low wall of stone where the patrol was gathered. The relief of being with them again was brief, because the enemy regrouping on the far slope began their charge. Once more, the sound of boots pounding over rock filled the air and the shouts grew louder. Sarah crouched beside Miller, who handed her a fresh magazine without a word. She slammed it into her rifle and racked the bolt, feeling the solid click that meant she was ready to fight again. The patrol opened fire in a coordinated burst, and Sarah joined them, her shots echoing in sharp rhythm with theirs. The enemy advance slowed under the barrage but did not stop entirely. Sarah aimed at the closest fighter and squeezed the trigger, sending him sprawling into the dust. More targets moved into view, and she shifted her aim quickly each time. Still, they kept coming, their determination as strong as the rocky walls around them. Miller shouted over, the noise telling everyone to prepare for close quarters. Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle, and her eyes locked on the enemy shapes charging through the smoke. The next few seconds would decide everything for the patrol, and there was no turning back.